I've got the pleasure to introduce Professor Leonard Suransky. Professor Leonard Suransky was born and raised in South Africa. He's got a BA from the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, an MSc in International Relations from the London School of Economics, and a PhD from the University of Michigan. He specializes in designing and administering international relations gaps, also the industrial relations gaps anyway, in the academic, public, and corporate sector. He has been widely published. He was dean of the Institute of International Relations at the University in Leiden, Holland, and is dean emeritus at the Webster University in Ghana, in case anyone wants to go there. Okay. It's been widely published, especially also on the Israel and Palestine situation. And that's what we're hearing about. Leonard, it's over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. After the what some people call a pogrom, or the attack of October 7th by Hamas of the Gaza envelope, as it's called, Hans and I were talking, and he said, why don't you come to Hermanus and give a talk on the kinds of things that you see going on? But that was October, and we came up with the title, Israel, the EU, and the Islamic Caliphate. And in a way, it wasn't such a bad title, Hans. It works today. So I'm going to talk to you about the setting in which I will look at this topic, Israel, the EU, and the Islamic Caliphate. So for several years, I've been writing about and talking about the authoritarian attack on the democratic world order. In other words, that we're in a new era, and I'm suggesting that it could go very badly for what we have come to be acquainted with, which is the post-World War II Western democratic UN order, with the UN famous recently, the ICJ, or the World Court. And it's an order which is certainly not perfect, is widely criticized, is considered to be old-fashioned. Certainly the UN Security Council, with the end of World War II major victors, plus Russia and China. So we've got the United States, France, the UK, Russia, and China on the UN Security Council. And the rest of the world has been baying and saying, what about us? What about us? And that's a very important institution, because that's the only place where those 5 countries have a veto. But that system has been underway after World War II, through the ensuing 40, 50, how many years has it been? It's 70, 80 years, through the Cold War, where in talking about the UN Security Council, not much was happening. Okay, so that's the background, that's the context. And I am suggesting that there is an attack on this order, and that it's growing, and that I would say today it's winning. And that is the authoritarian world order, an alternative world order. And instead of Pax America, we might be beginning to see that we, or our children or our grandchildren, will be living under Pax Sinica, an authoritarian world order, where there isn't much space or respect for free public opinion, free movement around the world, free mobilization, free association, free expression. You've got to be careful about what you say. In an authoritarian world order, maybe Leonard would be speaking in Hermanus this morning, or he would be very careful if he was doing so. And we know about that in South Africa because we lived under apartheid. And we know about a time when we had to be very careful where we said certain things. When I was teaching at Wits University, we knew our phones were tapped, and we went and talked anything important on the lawn, on the assumption that nobody could hear us there. Today, with all the fancy equipment that exists, we probably wouldn't have got away with that. So a turning point, which I suggest indicates the rise of militant Islam, was the 9/11 attack on the Manhattan Twin Towers and other important symbols in the United States, almost the US Congress, almost, but they also hit the Pentagon. And who did that? It was Al-Qaeda, and it was masterful, it was brilliant, it was carefully planned. They actually trained pilots at American schools how to take off. And some of the instructors were a little bit surprised that the students that were learning how to fly these little Piper planes, but learning how to fly, were less interested in landing than they were in taking off. Well, we know why. They weren't intending to land in a normal way and take almost 3,000 Americans and other people who were in that Twin Towers down with them. And the leader of this was a man from Saudi Arabia, a princeling from a very wealthy family, Osama bin Laden. The American response was understandable. In history, in modern history, attack the United States of America and get away with it. And America decided it would go to war. Kind of interesting is that Joe Biden said to Bibi Netanyahu, don't be careful not to have the same reaction we had to 9/11. We launched into 2 wars without really thinking very hard. Indeed, they had to look for this Al-Qaeda, but Al-Qaeda, unlike all the other wars that we've been used to, was not a country. There wasn't a country called Al-Qaeda that could be bombed. Al-Qaeda was hiding out in Afghanistan. So America attacked Afghanistan. They also attacked Iraq, and that was a crazy decision and a wrongly launched decision because there were lies about why Iraq should be a target. But the aim was to wipe out Al-Qaeda. And since the Taliban were the hosts, they became the target. But Al-Qaeda had an ideology, and that's the ideology that I want to focus on. That's the ideology that leads to an Islamic caliphate and leads to countries that are ruled by Sharia law. In other words, law that comes from the Quran, very strict, particularly against women, and that is a Western perspective. Maybe Islamic women do not consider that they're being put down when they're not allowed to go to school, when they're not allowed to show their faces, when they've got to cover their hair, etc., etc. But that was the Taliban ruled Afghanistan that America attacked and spent $1 trillion at least, if not more, fighting that war and eventually going home with their tail between their legs, having failed. The United States, which had failed in Vietnam after so brilliantly helping win World War II, were defeated again. And the day after, the Taliban came back into power with very similar rules. And a lot of what had been achieved there in trying to set up a Western-style democratic society where people had rights and women could teach at universities and study at universities and all the good things that we expect went down the drain. Now, we know that Osama bin Laden was brilliantly assassinated, and Al-Qaeda became less powerful than it was. But there was another movement called ISIS that took over. Now, ISIS achieved far more than Al-Qaeda. ISIS actually inhabited large swathes of Syria and Iraq, 100,000 square kilometers of those countries. and set up an Islamic Caliphate there. Once they had conquered those countries, they said, okay, here are the new rules, guys, and this is the way you got to live. There you have your caliphate, and it's running under Sharia law. There was subsequently another war against ISIS. And by and large, they were thrown out of those 100,000 square kilometers. But they haven't gone away. Where are they now? They are fighting on our continent, in countries, Boko Haram in northern Nigeria, which was there before ISIS came to Africa, but has joined up with them. They're in Mali, they're in Burkina Faso, they're in Niger, they're in Chad, they're even in Sudan. And what they do when they manage to take over parts of that territory, they impose and introduce Sharia law. So Africa, without us really being terribly aware of it, and without much of the world caring a damn, is being Islamicized or Islamized. I came up with a little note, I must look up where it was, which said that South Africa is being used as the finance center for these ISIS activities. I didn't know that. I'm not sure if it's definitely true, but that's what I read. Now, closer to home, there's an ISIS affiliate, Ahlu Sunnah wal Jama, ASWJ. They have been active in Cabo Delgado since 2017. 2017, that's 7 years ago. How come they haven't been beaten? How come they're still there? How come they're still intimidating citizens, burning houses? Now, South Africa has troops there. SADC has troops there. What I hear is that the main successful fighting group there comes from Rwanda. Not surprising, because Rwanda knows how to fight. We found out a couple of days ago that the South African National Defence Forces, SANDF, doesn't know how to fight very well, or is not equipped to fight very well, because they lost 2 of their troops days after they arrived in the eastern DRC to join a SADC group there that is fighting against an ISIS-like group that has been fighting on that side of the huge DRC for decades, armed by Rwanda, okay? And Rwanda is a big mate of ours. They're not part of SADC. We're spending 2 million rand sending those 2.9 thousand troops to the eastern DRC, but we have no fighter helicopters, attack helicopters to cover them. And military experts are saying that is the kiss of death. Okay, that's by way of background. So now we come to Hamas. Who are Hamas? They're an offshoot of the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. So the Muslim Brotherhood was founded by Hassan al-Banna in 1928. It was inspired by a religious scholar, Sayyid Qutb, who went to study in the United States in the 40s, I guess. He was shocked at what he saw there. He was shocked at the loose ethics, social ethics of the Americans, the fact that they were drinking as much as they drink, and of course, if you're a Muslim, you don't drink, the relative nakedness and exposure of women. And he came back to Egypt and said, we must press ahead with the Muslim Brotherhood because there's a terrible culture out there that could invade Egypt and corrupt us. So the idea of the Muslim Brotherhood was to return to strict Islamic law, and that is what the Muslim Brotherhood stands for. Now, fast forwarding to 2011, the Muslim Brotherhood, in the wake of the Arab Spring youth revolts, won an election. So the Arab Spring youth were calling for a more democratic, more Western, more of what we talk about as Pax Americana. But they went to election, and the Muslim Brotherhood had been preparing for ages, and they won the election. What happened quickly after that, not unusual for Egypt, is that Mohamed Morsi, who became the president, was overthrown. I think he's still in prison, and President al-Sisi took over in a military coup. It was only 1 year after the elections. So now, when we look at the war in Gaza, which we're coming to, people ask, why don't the Gazans, in the midst of this terrible war, and it is a terrible war, 28 or more thousand people killed, citizens. Well, a big chunk of them, according to the Israelis, are fighters. Why don't they go across the Rafah border, find some safe places away from the war while the war's going on? Which is what happens in almost every other war that I'm aware of. In the Syrian civil war, where President Assad, facing the same Arab Spring youth movement that he had seen elsewhere in the Arab world, decided he was not going to let it happen in Syria. And what ensued was a 10, 11, 12-year-old civil war, which is only tapering off now. 5 million people fled. Turkey absorbed 3.6 million. Lebanon, 1 million. And Europe, 1 million. Famously, the German chancellor said, I think if I'm not mistaken, my German's not as good as Hans's, wir kann das schaffen. We can manage this. Let's take these poor people who are running away, who've got nothing. That's what happens in wars. We've got a war going on between Ukraine and Russia right now, and there have been 6 million, mainly women and children, who have fled into Europe, 3 million of them in Poland, and being welcomed and taken in as refugees. But for the Gazan Palestinians, there is no outlet. Funnily enough, the latest news is that Egypt is building a walled area outside Rafah, which can house 100,000. But we know with Israel's pressure from the north, now to the very end of the south of Gaza, space for 100,000 will not be much good, because you've got over 1 million people who have left their homes in the north and the center to come down there. Nobody seems to want these refugees. After 48, 49, 190,000 of them came to Gaza. By the way, Gaza at that time was under the control of Egypt. The West Bank at that time was under the control of Jordan. One of the cynical comments one gets from the Israeli press is, how come for 20 years didn't Egypt say, you guys deserve independence? We'll give you independence in Gaza, or the Jordanians, we'll give you independence on the West Bank. But that 190,000 has turned into 2.1 million Palestinian refugees, and something over 1 million are sitting around the city of Rafah, which is the last city that the Israelis have not taken. In their response, and they didn't really listen to Mr. Biden, but he responded gently to the attack of October 7th. So now a few words about who are Hamas. So we said that they are an offshoot, a baby brother of the Muslim, or baby sister of the Muslim Brotherhood. Probably baby brother, because women are not that important in that world, I'm afraid, in terms politically. And they believe that lives should be lived according to the precepts of Muhammad, laid out in the Quran, a very strict, controlled existence, very similar to someone else that we have to talk about, and that is Ayatollah Khamenei of Iran. And anybody who knows anything about Iran today will remember that there have been protests, particularly by women, against having to wear the scarf, and they've been very firmly, if not violently, suppressed. And Iran is a lovely example of an Islamic Sharia law, very tough. Now, there's an anomaly here which I'm not going to get into. It just so happens that Hamas and Palestinians are Sunni Arabs, as are the Saudis, as are the Jordanians, as are the majority of Syrians, but not President Assad. He's a Shiite or of Shiite extraction. And yet, when it comes to Israel, that doesn't matter. Israel is the enemy. What is the goal of Hamas? Principally, it is to make sure that no infidel should ever rule over Muslims or over Muslim holy land. Now, wait a minute. How all of a sudden has little Israel become Muslim holy land? Well, in the 7th century, when Islam rose and reached the borders of Vienna and occupied Spain and Portugal and many other parts of Europe and imposed some of their ways and culture, the feeling is, or the ideology is, once Islam has occupied land, that land becomes holy and no infidels can rule it. And maybe they will be tolerated there. So there is a history in the Arab world which Jews actually prospered under. 60% of Israelis, and this is not very widely known, might even be 65%, are not Europeans. They come from Morocco, Libya, Tunisia, Egypt, or they come from Asia, from Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Iran. The day after the 1948 war, they were expelled. And they had been living there under dhimmi status. Dhimmi means you're an infidel, you're not like us, you're a second-class citizen. We are prepared to have you living in our state under conditions. You're not allowed to serve in the army, and you'll pay a certain tax. That is called dhimmi, D-H-I-M-M-I. So some people are saying now, when the Palestinians, or Hamas in this case, take over the land of Israel, maybe the Jews that live there, and there are 7+ million Jews living in the state of Israel and on the West Bank, maybe they will revert to dhimmi status. You can't rule this country because it's Arab Holy Land. Or maybe one of the things one reads in the literature is that all those who were there before 47, 48, 49 war can stay, and their children. But all the others have to go back. And not surprisingly, Israelis would ask, back where? I mean, the 60% who are non-whites in apartheid parlance, are they going to be allowed to go back to Morocco and Tunisia and so on? And where are the Ashkenazi European Jews supposed to go? Are they going to go back to Poland and to Ukraine and so on? Unthinkable from their point of view. In fact, the Israelis argue that something like 750,000 or 700,000 Palestinians left Israel during the war. Some were pushed, for sure. Some were frightened and ran away. Listened to the Mufti of Jerusalem and fled when he said, go away, come back in 3 weeks. You can have all the the Jewish cars and houses. It'll just take 3 weeks. The Israelis say, well, look, 750,000 of our people came here. We absorbed them. We integrated them. We did not keep them in refugee camps with the myth that one day they're going to return to their grandparents' or great-grandparents' house, for which they have a rusty old key. You settle your refugees. We have already settled ours. Well, of course, that doesn't go down very well. But now, what is the solution to this problem? People are talking about two states, right, left, and center, whereas the reality today is a one state with an occupied West Bank, 700,000 Jews living in settlements on the West Bank. Many people have talked about Gaza as being occupied, even though Israel left in 2005 under Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, who said, okay, I'm going to have a peace solution here. And part of my peace is I'm giving Gaza to the Palestinians. At that time, Yasser Arafat was still alive, leader of Fatah, or the PLO, and he was going to take that over. And here, Mr. Arafat, is a whole chunk of land, not very big, I'm afraid, but why don't you set up your Palestinian state there? Well, what happened is that there were elections in which Hamas did incredibly well in 2006. And in 2007, Hamas chased out Arafat and his people and his governors and his mayors and his army in what was a civil war. So, two states. Is there space for two states? I argue that there isn't. Because if you've got 700,000 Jews, and half of them, of course, are children or close to being children, living in clusters on the West Bank, where are you going to have a second state? Let's suppose that Gaza is part of that second state under whatever will materialize after the defeat of Hamas. So one of my good friends, who's often on Al Jazeera or BBC or CNN, Yossi Meckelberg, says to me, look, we will have a confederation, the Palestinians will rule the West Bank, and if the Jews that are living there want to stay there, they'll be under Palestinian rule. So he's never come to visit me in Cape Town. And I said, come to South Africa and get a feel for what that would look like. Because in the world out there, South Africa is still Mandela land. It's still the blue-eyed boy. It's still perfect. It's still democratic, which is why Mr. Xi of China and Mr. Putin of Russia really like it that our president, Ramaphosa, is their poster boy for BRICS and for going to the ICJ, because we are democratic and we are Mandela land and we are perfect. Whereas those of us that live here might disagree with that somewhat or a whole lot. So what I'm saying in the context of the Middle East is, if I were a settler on the West Bank and I were to be governed by a Palestinian government, given the track record of just about every single Arab state in the region, maybe bar Turkey, there's no democratic state there. They're all dictatorships. They're all part of the new authoritarian order. They always have been. I didn't realize they were catching up with a new order, but they're well placed to do that. Would you like to live under them? I wouldn't. So I'm saying that under BRICS and under the leadership of Ramaphosa, who has failed in his leadership of most of his SOEs and almost everything else in this country, we have a new unit that gradually intends to take over from Pax America and institute something different. Imagine that when you switch on your television, you'll be watching Chinese movies rather than Netflix. Your kids will have to learn Mandarin in school, or maybe Russian. That is what the intention is. Most significantly, the main intention is to undermine the dollar, because BRICS countries are talking about trading in their own currencies. They don't have a BRICS currency yet, but that might be coming. As much as possible, let's trade whatever trade we're doing in our own currencies and not use the dollar. Let's undermine the dollar. Well, if they succeed in that, we can say goodbye to America, even if Mr. Trump becomes president and is busy making it great again. But while Mr. Trump is messing already with Mr. Biden and preventing him from spending something like $120 million on resupplying Ukraine and resupplying Israel, and even spending 10 million humanitarian aid for Hamas, Trump said to the Republican majority in the House, I know you've been negotiating for a long time on a better dispensation for refugees coming across the border, and you've got a deal. Don't do that deal. Hold off on it. Let's hurt Biden more. And that brings me to my last point. That in Europe, we have parts of Europe that are no-go areas where Muslims live. There are a lot of refugees that have come and gone back and forth in Europe over all these centuries. Usually they learn the language, they hopefully find a place to live, they send their kids to school, and they merge into that culture to some degree. They might still be very proud Ukrainians in Poland or in Sweden, or they might be very proud Syrians in those places, but they accept that they've got a new dispensation, that they're guests in a new country. But no, the drive to Islamize and to have a caliphate of Britain in parts of Sweden, and certainly in places like Molenbeek and Saint-Denis in France, where they say, we don't want the police here. We run our own little town. We are the majority here, and we are instituting what we want. The last important thing that I missed to say is the great head of all of what's happening in this current war in the Middle East is Iran. They have surrounded Israel and they're strangling Israel. They have Hezbollah on the northern border, and there's a war going on there. They have the Houthis down south disrupting, and I saw a picture this morning of a ship that was sunk. I saw it sinking on a video, and that's why we've got these stinky cows in the Cape Town harbour, where everybody in Greater Cape Town has been wondering, what is that smell? Well, there's a ship with, I don't know how many tens of thousands of cattle on its way from point A to point B that couldn't get through the Suez Canal. And I think the SPCA found out this morning that several of them were dead and forced them to be evacuated from the ship. We've got a new kind of world here. Ramaphosa was boasting the other day that, look, because of the war in Gaza, we've got more traffic coming across the bottom of Africa. Isn't that great? We're earning money here. But anyway, I've tried to outline for you a story about a changing world. I'm suggesting that possibly over time, I'm not giving a time on it, we are moving from what we have been comfortable with and pretty much believe in as the American Pax America, the Washington Consensus, to Pax Seneca. And we've got two wars happening around us. The Russians are not losing against the Ukrainians. In fact, I think they're winning. The Ukrainians had to withdraw from one little town just a few days ago. Putin will get his Donbas region. And then, in a year or two, maybe he'll move on Georgia or the Baltic states. And Europe understands that this is their way of life being threatened, that NATO is their best hope against it. And yet you have an emerging President Trump who says, if they haven't paid their 2%, I welcome Putin donoring them. So we've got these two wars, which are not looking good. The Israelis are determined to win in Gaza because they know that that will deter the Hezbollah in Lebanon and other people who might be wanting to attack them. They will have shown them what the cost would be. But it is a very fraught situation. Thank you very much.
Leonard, thank you very much. I'm sure there are going to be many questions, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, Andrew. Can you comment on the Russian presence in the Sahara area?
So the Russians have moved into the vacuum. They were in Africa. They have been missing in Africa, as we know. Putin's friend and former cook, who was running the show there, got a bit uppity and had to be removed, as was Putin's main contender in the elections, Navalny, killed yesterday or the day before. And they'll prove that he was killed because the day before he died, he was joking with the judge in his case, saying, I need a little bit more money. You are very rich. And he was well, and he was joking. Okay, so that's what a dictator does. That's what an absolutist or authoritarian leader does. So yes, Russia has moved into the vacuum in Africa and is going to help them fight against the ISIS and its other parties. Hope that makes sense.
So are you saying that Russia is not aligning themselves with ISIS, they're fighting ISIS? Is that correct?
They are fighting ISIS because Russia has, in its southern areas, several stans, Tajikistan, etc., and they do not trust them. And Mr. Xi, on the northeast side of China, has done everything to suppress the Muslims who live there, whose name I don't sort of recall at the moment, but you know who I mean. So they don't like Muslims. So in this case, yes, they're fighting against them.
Right, ladies and gentlemen, another question. The question is, she says she might have missed what you said, but why did the Palestinians not flee and become refugees from Gaza?
Very good question. And that's why we have refugee camps in Gaza on the West Bank, which is ruled by the Palestinian Authority, which I visited with students of mine in Lebanon and in Syria. You've got refugee camps. Why? Because they're waiting to return to their holy land. And they've been waiting for 4 generations, and they are promised, just be patient, it might take a long time. You are bound to be here. Don't go anywhere else. We don't want you to leave. We want you to stay here for the day that you return.
I thought the answer is that on the one hand, the Israelis are not allowing the Palestinians to flee, and secondly, the Egyptians do not want them to enter Egypt either. Is that not so?
Well, the Israelis are certainly not welcoming them into Israel. The Egyptians are very clear. They've got their own problems with the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt itself. They do not want any little brother of the Muslim Brotherhood coming into Egypt, into the Sinai. They don't want them messing with problems that Egypt is dealing with in Sinai, with people smuggling arms and drugs and what have you. They don't want them. Nobody wants them. Nobody wants them. I mean, there's something like 400,000, 500,000 in Syria and in Lebanon. If you said to them, will you take another 500,000? These people are suffering. They would say no. And if you go further afield to places like Iraq, which is bigger, take a few 100,000 of these refugees who are in dire straits in the midst of a terrible war. Would they take them? No. Partly because of the myth that one day you're returning home. The other part of it is you don't want Palestinians running around. They're very clever people. They are very radical people, can be, not always. Some of them are absolutely like you and me. No, we don't want to take any refugees from there.
Well, of course, after the 7 years war, 7-day war in Israel, where many Palestinians fled into Jordan, a few years later, in 1973, Jordan expelled the Palestinians from Jordan because of the troubles they were creating in Jordan, and expelled them into Syria and Lebanon for the same reason.
They nearly killed the king. They nearly killed the king. Thanks to his driver, he was saved.
So that is part of the reason why the other countries around Israel and Palestine don't want the Palestinians to settle in their parts of the country. Is that true?
I think there's a feeling that some of them are very radical and committed to maybe a secular radical political future or to a Sharia political future. And we don't need that. That's the kind of thinking. One should say that there are 2 million Palestinians, Israeli citizens, living relatively happy in Israel. And I have talked to them, and many have reported on this. If you say to them, do you want to go to Ramallah? Do you want to go to Jericho? Do you want to go to Syria, Damascus, wherever? They'll say, no way, I'm doing okay here. I am happy to be in this country. The dilemma for Israel is that it cannot remain Jewish and absorb 2 plus 2 plus 2 plus 2 million people, because there are 2 million in Gaza, 2 million on the West Bank, 2 million in Jordan. There are 500,000 in Syria, another 250,000 in Lebanon. Israel then would not survive as a Jewish state, and they cannot envisage that.
Another question, anybody? The lady was saying Israel exists because of the Holocaust, where 6 million Jews were murdered. And if that will happen again, she says, if the world turns against Israel.
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for that idea that Israel would not have come about if it wasn't for the Holocaust. The thing that is so difficult for the Israelis to understand is with the vast lands that the Muslims have. We're talking about the whole of North Africa, huge chunks of Asia. Why do you want our little land, which we believe was given to us by God in a pledge to Abraham, and let us just be here? That's all we've got. We have nowhere else to go. We've been treated badly throughout history wherever else we were prior to the Holocaust. Just let us be here, and we're going to fight to stay here. So it would be a huge tragedy if, for the third time in Jewish history, the Jews were thrown out of Israel.
Good morning, thank you. The Jews have been persecuted for centuries and centuries, but we need to remind ourselves that we're not persecuted by Muslims, but by Christians. A lot of what is going on now is this guilt conscience. And what we must also not forget is that it was a badly managed creation of an Israel state, and the Palestinians were dispossessed of what had been their ancestral land. So it is a huge mess. I know what went wrong. I don't know how to fix it. But I think we've got to understand that it is very much more complex than just Muslims being anti-Israel, because the Jews know what it's like to be persecuted for centuries by us, by Christians, not by Muslims.
That was very good. I agree with you. The bottom line is that there's this tiny sliver of land. The Palestinians have been there, let's say, at the utmost since 700 BC. The Jews have been there for 3,000 years. Now, when you go to a Muslim and say, my Torah tells me that God promised me this land, you can understand when they say we don't read Hebrew. We're not interested in your Torah. We're not interested in your history. We have been here and you arrived, and we don't like that. And that's why we've got a conflict. And it seems insoluble for that tiny, tiny piece of land.
Yes, please. Under the present circumstances, is Hamas still overwhelmingly supported by the population of Gaza?
If you live in a dictatorship, you don't speak out and say, I don't like you, because you get your head cut off. What is starting to happen now that Hamas has been severely wounded is that there are people coming out and saying, we never liked them. How large that is, I don't know. Because on the other hand, there's tremendous anger, understandable, against what Israel has done. Israel has destroyed Gaza, I think, beyond what would be wise. And I don't know what they were thinking that they could just raise whole cities. But we see that happening in Ukraine. Cities are just shot and shot and shot until there's nothing left, which is terrible, and war is bad. So is there a new voice in Gaza saying, we are ready to ditch Hamas? Thank you for saving us from Hamas. I don't know. There are a few voices that are coming out. We'll have to wait and see.
Question is, why do Muslims immigrate to Christian countries?
Well, that's what the Christians in some of those places I mentioned say to them. If you guys don't like it here, and you don't like our culture and our way of life and our laws, go back to your countries and enjoy your Sharia law or your stricter Muslim law. But why come here as guests and be received as refugees, and then after a little while turn against us and say, in this part of the country, we are going to make it a Muslim province or Muslim town? One answer is that there is a feeling like large swathes of Europe were occupied by Muslims, and this is a non-belligerent, non-military way to reoccupy Europe. And that is why the right wing in Europe is now becoming quite predominant. So if any of you have got access to this week's Economist, their lead article tells a story of how many European countries are turning right and are starting to question what to do about refugees.
How strong is their voice in Israel against what the current government is doing?
Very strong. Prior to the war, you will have heard that there was a 50-50 division in the country, with people rejecting the idea that the Supreme Court, the High Court, should lose its power to say no to a law passed in the Knesset. People demonstrated every Saturday for most of a year in their thousands and tens of thousands. They closed down roads. The amazing thing is that the day the war started, those same groups became help groups, sending food, sending clothes, looking after the families that had to leave the Gazan border and the Lebanese border. But today there is great dissension. The polling for Bibi Netanyahu is half of that of Gantz, his main rival. In other words, if there was an election today, Netanyahu would lose along with his very right-wing friends.
So if there were a new government, would that new government stop the invasion of Gaza?
I think there's a kind of consensus that the war has to be finished. What they say about Israeli wars is that the war goes on until the Americans say stop. And that has been true of every one of the wars. And it appears, if you read yesterday's news, that the United States is going to go to the Security Council and come up with, has already drafted a position that says we need a ceasefire now. So there's an Algerian proposal before the UNSC, which says stop the war now, totally, end of war, give back the hostages, which is really what Hamas wants. If they stop now, Sinwar, who I read in the last day, Sinwar, as a prisoner in Israeli prisons, contacted the Ayatollah of Iran and said, can we work together? Many, many years ago. If Sinwar survives, he will come out of hiding saying, we won. So the notion that Israel can win this war has always been a nonsense. But they do want to, there are 4 more brigades hiding in Rafah. They would like to damage them before they stop. And the terrible thing in terms of timetables is that on May 10th, the Islamic fast begins, Ramadan, yeah, from morning to evening. And that's a very hard time, not that the people have been eating well along the way. It's been a very, very bad war for them. So a new government would have a different idea about what to do next, but I think they would still want to carry on and finish off what they can of Hamas. I don't think it's possible. Hamas is not going to disappear.
Can I ask a question? So much of the world is trying to pressurize Israel to stop the war or some way or another. But there's no voices saying, Hamas, why don't you stop?
Well, that is one of the anomalies that really upset the Israelis. That for about 48 hours, or maybe it was more, there was tremendous sympathy for what happened on October 7th. And maybe it's not fair to say 48 hours. Why is nobody blaming these guys for committing what is, it really is, some kind of a genocide? Why isn't anybody saying to Hamas, what you did on October 7th was genocidal? The Israelis, of course, claim that what they're doing is not genocidal. And one of the jokes is, if they really wanted to do a genocide, how come the 190,000 have become 2.2 million, et cetera, in the other areas, that they do not have genocidal intent? I'm sure there's some crazy Israelis who are genocidal, but I think generally speaking, it's not the policy.
Last question, anybody? Two questions. Why is the IDF struggling to find the hostages, first of all? And secondly, with all the demonstrations around the world, why aren't there demonstrations against Hamas saying, stop what you're doing and release the hostages?
Yeah, I think Hamas knows that is their secret weapon. So they are doing their damnedest to hide them, and they're doing a damn good job of it. They probably in some tunnels, and these tunnels go down 40 meters, and they are huge, and incredible amounts of money have been spent on them.
So can I just interrupt? Do you think some of the hostages are sheltered outside Gaza and other areas? Maybe Iran?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so. I don't know. I have no indication of that. Rather that they're being spirited away. We know that some of them were staying with families for a while and then moved away from there, from those that have been released. But I think they're very well hidden. Maybe they've been taken out somehow because there are tunnels between Rafah and the Sinai. And the second question was, why doesn't anybody protest against Hamas? Well, you know, I studied and lived for 15 years in Ann Arbor, Michigan. And I know the great universities of America. And the fact that at places like Harvard and Columbia, there are young kids who are out demonstrating because it's cool to do and saying from the river to the sea. And when asked which river, which sea, they sometimes can't answer. When asked where is Israel, they can't answer. But it's the power of the social media in our time has changed our political world. And it is something, it's a new order that makes a hell of a lot of difference for good and for ill. So that's something perhaps we should talk about another time.
Leonard, thank you very, very much. Thank you for taking the time to talk.
Okay, thanks a lot. It was a pleasure being there. I'm sorry I couldn't see you all.